All right, hopefully everybody saw the slide advance. Okay, thanks, Ty. Want to spend just a moment to go over what our intent for today is. Transition of the coordinator role from NIPWIF and Maryland agencies to SRBC, and you've met our team. Our contact information will appear at the end of today's presentation. Something else that I will say is that this slide deck will also be made available to you or anybody else who may want it. The slide deck includes a lot of hyperlinks. There's going to be a lot of information that we're going to present. It is not our intention, nor is it our expectation that you need to take a lot of detailed notes and keep track of everything that we're going to put out. The resources that we're making mention of are going to be available through hyperlinks and or through a web page that is right now under construction by SRBC that will be devoted to this partnership for enhancing freshwater mussels through the Chesapeake Bay region. The first or the next part of today's presentation is just going to briefly touch on some of the milestone events regarding the Chesapeake Bay Mussel Group. So you guys are far more familiar with these events than we at SRBC are, but we're going to talk briefly about the 2020 STAC workshop, as well as the April 2022 workshop that NIFWIF and Maryland agencies hosted. We'll also make mention of the Mussel committee meetings that took place virtually in February of this year. Some of the things that we really hope to accomplish in a two-way conversation today is to get to the ultimate goals. Again, as coordinators for this partnership, we've had to pick up and review a lot of your work already, and we're making some inferences and interpretations, and we want to make sure that we've got the correct pathway, and we're very much here to try to help facilitate your ambitions and needs, but not necessarily to push you into things that we don't necessarily understand either, if that makes sense. We are going to spend some time talking about the Chesapeake Bay Programs Framework. Leveraging the Bay Agreement will provide benefit to the overarching goals, at least as we've come to understand them for the two groups that are very much interested in freshwater mussels throughout the Chesapeake Bay. The Chesapeake Bay Programs Framework will be particularly vital to the group of folks that are interested in the consideration of freshwater mussels as a water quality improvement, enhancement, or even as consideration as a BMP in the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. And so we're going to spend some time going through the Chesapeake Bay Programs Framework and organizational structure. And again, based on our agency, we feel like we are fairly well positioned to at least help facilitate integration with that apparatus where you guys see that it is serving your purposes. We also put together a suggested organizational structure for this partnership. We will present that, and you guys have been very generous with your time so far, and many of you have already volunteered to help out. We will be showing a structure that looks maybe a little different than what we put into a survey questionnaire back in April, but we are absolutely looking for folks to be part of an overall steering committee, as well as leads on work groups around mussels as a water quality enhancement mechanism, as well as just the biodiversity conservation and restoration of mussels throughout the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And there is going to be a fair amount of our time today devoted to really fleshing out what are the near-term actions or priority items, and how can the people with your levels of experience and expertise help advance those near-term priorities. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the survey outcomes that we generated in the April 2023 survey. And then, as I said, we do want to make a finalized list of near-term priorities. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what to expect next from SRBC and the partnership, as well as provide an opportunity for folks to provide news and announcements to the rest of the group. Again, if you do have comments or information to share, please drop it into the chat. Tyler and Ellen are monitoring that chat while I go through the slide deck. You guys have anything, Ellen or Ty, that you want to add at this point? This is just meant to give a segue that we're going to talk quickly about the Mussel Partnership milestone events. So again, when I mentioned this slide deck, if you're seeing my cursor change to a finger point, there's a hyperlink behind this image of the March 2020 STAC workshop document that came out. If you're inclined, you can get access to this slide deck, and this information will be readily available. I'm sure most of you participated in that STAC workshop or have access to this report already. But anyway, that's the way this slide series is presented. There will be a lot of hyperlinks, and I'll try to point those out as we go through. The workshop objectives, and again, this is high level, is not our intention to be exhaustive on what occurred at that STAC workshop, but it was a fairly broad examination of freshwater mussel issues in the bay, including ecosystem services, including conservation and restoration, and including creating more awareness of freshwater mussels for their phenomenal life traits and biology. There were some research findings and recommendations, and again, this is not the full list of research findings and recommendations that are contained in this report, but there were a couple things that stuck out to us because they also were themes in some of the other more recent milestone events. So it was clearly called out as a finding that there is no aggregated database of mussel populations across the Chesapeake Bay watershed region. And so a recommendation was to compile and analyze the existing mussel distribution data sets and aggregate those into some shareable format. I think that's an ambition that would serve for sure the biodiversity conservation and restoration interests, but also would be very beneficial to those folks who are very interested in freshwater mussels as a water quality enhancement. Another research finding was that there have been peer-reviewed papers that have documented the capability of mussels to enhance denitrification. A recommendation is that more specific research and focus occur within the Chesapeake Bay watershed region. And I'm going to move ahead to the next milestone event. Was in April 2022, and NIFWIF and Maryland agencies held a workshop on freshwater mussels and how to enhance a regional partnership within the Bay region. I'll point out this document, I cannot find it online, but SRBC will provide this when our website is up and running, which should happen sometime in June. If you are interested in the readout from that workshop, we'll make it accessible to you. Not surprisingly, the workshop objectives were similar to what the STAC workshop focused on, and some of the key needs and next steps are shown here on this slide. The next steps really that I put up here were to essentially form two groups with the interest in freshwater mussels around the biodiversity conservation and restoration element, as well as consideration of freshwater mussels as a water quality enhancement. And we've maintained that separation in core focus to today's meeting. And the last kind of milestone events that I wanted to touch on were the two February virtual meetings that happened this year. This is where those separate pathways were really more defined. And NIFWIF and Maryland held two separate meetings. A lot of overlap occurred between the participants in both those meetings, and in large measure, that's why we chose to have a single meeting today as opposed to dividing this out. We think there's a lot of commonality, but there are obviously distinctions between these two core aims, and I think you'll see as we move through today's presentation that the structure will accommodate the overlap for both these groups, but allow for some of the separate focus that's unique to each one of the larger aims. First place we want to do is just check and make sure that that we've captured the fundamental purpose of each of these two groups. I think we have, but want to give ourselves a stop and a mechanism here. So is it clear that we've got two key core groups that share a lot of interest and probably a lot of resources around freshwater mussels throughout the Chesapeake region, but that one group is principally focused on advancing conservation and restoration to maintain mussel biodiversity, while the other core interest is to assess mussels as a water quality enhancement or best management practice for the control of nutrients and or sediment in the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. And I'll take a pause there. If you want to add a thumbs up or your thoughts into the chat, or if you want to unmic and make a comment, you're welcome to do so. Thumbs up. Okay. I didn't think we were too far off the mark there, so that's gratifying. We're going to segue next into some information about the Chesapeake Bay restoration process and the framework that the Chesapeake Bay Programs Partnership has to offer. And again, the intention is not to say that everything in this group has to go through the Bay protocols or the Bay framework, but that the Bay restoration process goals and ambitions do accommodate, I think, a lot of what both of these groups' ambitions are. And again, for sure, under a water quality enhancement, BMP integration into the Bay Programs framework is going to be essential. What we're showing up here on this slide is a vision statement for the Chesapeake Bay program. And certainly the restoration of water quality elements within the Bay properly is a key focus, but the Bay program is also comprehensive in terms of the overall Chesapeake watershed, and restoring ecosystem functions throughout is part of the vision for the Bay program. This slide is just put this one up here because it does show that there's already been generations of effort, activity, and interest in understanding and restoring the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem as well as its watershed ecosystem. Again, not something to memorize, but you see on this slide a ton of hyperlinks to some key documents, some web pages that have ongoing information, and just a history of how we got here. I'm showing through these arrows that there's a couple of key dates and items here that are worth pointing out. 1983 was the original Chesapeake Bay Agreement that established the partners. So we have the states that are in the ecosystem jurisdiction So we're going from 1983 when the Chesapeake Bay Agreement, the initial agreement occurred. We're currently under the 2014 Bay's Watershed Agreement, and I've got 2025 highlighted because that is the date according to the Phase 3 watershed implementation plans by which the measures for eventual restoration of the bay in terms of pollutant loads are to be in place. It's not when the bay is going to expect to be restored, the bay and its watershed, but that date is when the agreement calls for implementation of the measures that will be necessary to achieve bay cleanup. This slide shows the Chesapeake Bay Programs organization. Again, this is a hyperlink. There's a lot of information in here that describes the organizational arrangement. We bring this up because the Freshwater Mussel Partnership's ultimate goals line up with the existing Chesapeake Bay Programs framework, and I'll just point out quickly a few key areas of possible overlap and integration. So for the group with the aim of principally advancing conservation and restoration to maintain mussel biodiversity, there is a group in the Bay apparatus under a goal implementation team that is devoted to sustainable fisheries, and there's one that's devoted to habitat. The actions and activities and the ambitions that occur in these two goal implementation teams, or GITs as they're known, have a lot of commonality with advancing conservation and restoration for mussel biodiversity and awareness, alignment, coordination, or just understanding of what's going on in those two GITs should be helpful, beneficial, and perhaps advantageous to this particular group. For the water quality best management practice group, similarly, there is a goal implementation team that's devoted to maintaining healthy watersheds, and especially there is a water quality goal implementation team that has responsibility for evaluating and approving the recommendations for best management practice that have efficiencies or reductions in nutrients and sediment loads within the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. And so integration, alignment, and coordination with those two goal implementation teams will be essential to getting freshwater mussels through an evaluation process as to their potential for water quality enhancements. Again, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed model, the question isn't whether mussels have the ability to adjust or influence water quality. It's really, for this purpose, are they going to be able to generate some sort of reduction efficiency in the Bay watershed model? And then also I have highlighted in yellow a number of other groups, goal implementation teams that probably have benefit or supporting information to both of these outcomes and groups, including the Fostering Chesapeake Stewardship Goal Implementation Team, which is really devoted towards raising the profile of the Chesapeake Bay ecosystem in regard for its quality as well as enhancements. There's an advisory committee, the Science and Technical Advisory Committee, which many of you participated in the 2020 STAC work group. It's very much an ally for what you guys want to do. That's where science and technical foundation items take place in the Bay framework. There's also a communications work group that has as its mission to help communicate science and technology information within the overall Bay program organization, as well as to create messages for stakeholders at large that may include the general public. It may include elected officials and policymakers and decision makers. So again, there's good reason to be aware of the Chesapeake Bay program's organizational framework as well as its activities. And again, for the group that's primarily interested in water quality outcomes related to freshwater mussels, there's going to be integration within these goal implementation teams and other parts of the framework. I want to just acknowledge my own awareness or awakening, and I want to give Joe Wood, hopefully you're out there, Joe, credit for bringing this set of taxa to my awareness and knowledge. I've been involved in water issues my entire life and for over 30 years in my professional career, and I had really very limited understanding of just how awe-inspiring freshwater mussels are. If this is a hyperlink to a story that appeared in Vox, credit given to Chris Barnhart for assembling it. There is lots of really what I found to be just fascinating, awe-inspiring information in here. There are many links to videos that just show really the uniqueness and the evolutionary wonder of freshwater mussels as a class of organisms. I really am happy that we're part of this in some measure, and I think that just as a gateway to being more aware of resources and have more regard, there cannot be enough promotional information like this advocated for and made aware. Mussels as a water quality living filter. I bring these two documents up again, not for anybody to digest right now. You can see my cursor has changed. These will be hyperlinks in the slide deck. The image that I'm hovering over now on the left is the Chesapeake Bay program's protocols for having best management practices developed and considered by the water quality goal implementation team for authorization within the Chesapeake Bay watershed model. So this is essentially what steps does someone or a group need to go through in order to get a new BMP approved. And over on the right is probably an analog to what the freshwater mussel water quality enhancement may potentially look like at some point. This is for oysters as a BMP. There was an expert panel that had been active for a number of years, and just earlier this year, they released a set of recommendations for very specific protocols that will allow for oysters to gain credit as a water quality improvement mechanism. There are a lot of details and there are a lot of specifics, but for those in the pathway to look at freshwater mussels as a water quality enhancement device in the Chesapeake Bay watershed model, these two documents can provide a lot of insight and perhaps blueprints. So next thing we're going to do is put up what we've put together as a suggested structure for this freshwater mussel partnership. Again, it's a suggestion. We're not here to declare what hard and fast has to happen, but from our perspective and as what we expect as our role as a coordination, we've got a framework in mind. And I see, Joe, you have your hand raised. If you want to speak, please do so.
Sorry. So I just wanted to offer a few thoughts on thinking about like how this work integrates with the Bay work. And I would just say that we're sort of at an interesting place in the Bay world right now, I think. I don't know if any of you have seen the CESA report that recently came out, the comprehensive evaluation of system response. But I think that it offered a new vision for where the Bay program might go, or at least where STAC thinks it should go. And one of the things that's in there, I think pretty heavily, and when I think about mussels, is that like we need to focus on the living resource and how we can benefit it. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about with mussels. Like, are there things that we can do that are beneficial for mussels that it just makes me think that, like, I'm not against pursuing the BMP route, but that there is some momentum right now to think about things that just aren't exclusively a BMP, but are good for living resources. And so, you know, we've got a lot of things to work on and to think about, but I would just encourage the partners here to think not only in the lens of like that the Bay program might be interested if we get it to be a nutrient reduction BMP, but also that, like, you know, if there are good things that we can do that benefit the living resource, that fits with the direction that the Bay program wants to go. So I'll share that link for what it's worth. It's a long report, but I do think it's getting a lot of attention for new Bay initiatives.
Lisa, if you want to chime in, please do so.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for saying that, Joe, because sometimes I feel like I kind of come in as the wet blanket sometimes, but having worked on both the saltwater side in a previous incarnation with the Long Island Sound Study and oyster restoration, and working on freshwater mussels now in this stage of my career, yeah, I get nervous if we get down this road of like freshwater mussels are going to improve water quality and putting them back is going to fix the watershed, because it is just, they are not equivalent, right? Oyster reef restoration and just all of that stuff. Like, I get really nervous when people say we did it with oysters, we can do it with freshwater mussels, and coming at it from that BMP or from that water quality improvement service is, I think, dangerous. And so I really appreciate what Joe said about, if we make it better for mussels as a, you know, biotic resource, that will eventually, I think, get us to sediment load reduction and, you know, bed stabilization and all of those good things. But putting it forward as, if we put mussels in, we're going to improve the water quality, and it's a 1-to-1, I think is just, it's a dangerous thought process, especially for people that are less familiar with freshwater mussels, right? So it's a little more nuanced than that. And I think coming at it, as Joe said, from let's do what we can for mussels, because then we will get these other benefits as sort of the secondary effect. But that the biodiversity preservation, I mean, for heaven's sakes, we have so many listed species and near to be listed species in the watershed, right? That alone, I think, should be driving the bus, and improving water quality to benefit those resources. And like, we can almost think of freshwater mussels as more the polishers, the tertiary, you know, last treatment, as opposed to, if we stick them in, they're going to fix the water quality. So that's, I wanted to thank Joe for his thoughts, and I wholeheartedly agree. So thank you.
So here's a slide. It's fairly busy. This shows the organizational structure in a quick summary of some of the roles as we've seen it. And again, these are just this is a suggested framework. It's not ironclad, but we offer this up. We also acknowledge that during the survey that we put out in April, the survey questions for how people may want to choose to participate and volunteer their time and their energy and their experience, it doesn't look exactly like this structure in this framework. We've got a steering committee shown at the top. Over along the left side margin, you know, we have a suggestion for perhaps how many people would be part of this and how they would be represented. Again, it's really up to you guys. Numerically, you're a fairly small group of people, and you know, we certainly are grateful for your participation and don't want to overtax anyone. But we look at the steering committee as essentially, you know, I have over here driving the overall progress of the group. So it would be the folks at the steering committee who, you know, looked down the horizon at the long range goals. They would interact with various resource agencies and the Chesapeake Bay program as warranted. And they would also coordinate between the two work groups, one around living filters and the other biodiversity conservation and restoration. We see our role as the coordinators here to the side. we are essentially what I would say is like the professional staff for the partnership. So our role would be to help facilitate communications within the group, as well as to help coordinate the scheduling of steering committee meetings. And I think based on discussions with folks who've been part of this, as well as the survey that we put out, like roughly meetings occurring on a quarterly basis, perhaps with some more frequent here and there as needed. It seems to be the rhythm and appetite that people have or see as necessary for the partnership. I've mentioned it a couple of times. We are constructing a web page, and I'll show you an example of one that we've got up and running now for a different purpose, but that's kind of the model we have. We would put together on SRBC's web apparatus a particular page devoted to this partnership, and there will be resources available, contact information, calendar, and a place for news and announcements. Level in this framework is essentially a leadership element for the two groups, the biodiversity conservation and restoration work group, as well as a water quality improvement work group. These would be somewhat different from the steering committee, although the steering committee would very likely have representation from members of these two work group leads. It would be their chief role would be focusing on the goals unique to each of those groups. Working with then underneath, we have a bunch of unnamed items. These would be the participants who can work very specifically on any of the near-term priorities. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those on our next on the next slide. But this is this is kind of how we've grown to look at an organizational model for this partnership. Those priority items that were unspecified on the prior slide could very well emerge from this group of possibilities down here. Many of these were priorities that came out of the STAC work group in 2020, or that came out of the workshop that NIFWIF and the Maryland agencies put together in 2022, and also were distilled out of the two virtual meetings that happened in February of this year. So, again, essentially, we don't view SRBC's role as picking what these priorities are, but more along the lines of helping to make sure that the partnership has what it takes and needs to move forward for the overarching goals. So I'll take a pause here, I guess. I'm not sure how best to rank or include these, and certainly there may be others that do not show up on this slide. Maybe if there are folks who've been part of the steering committee or have a strong sense and want to come off mic and talk to the group, now's probably a good time to do so.
Hey, Jamie, this is Matt Ashton.
Hey, Matt.
Can you hear me?
Can hear you, yes.
Yeah, so I think I'll just mention the data aggregation goal or action as a goal. And I think as a goal, it's fine, but I think the very first thing that needs to be done is, well, what does that mean? What data, what kind of data, like what spatial representation? Because one, to know what's the purpose of it, what's being measured for what reason, and more importantly, just because every state kind of keeps mussel data very restrictive, much like brook trout data, even from a bay program context. So when I think of like brook trout goals, bay program, that's measured in like I believe it's like percent of 8-digit or some watershed scale occupied, and there's a goal to increase that percentage of watersheds occupied. So that data is very coarse, and it's coarse intentionally. So I think just knowing that, or coming to some idea of what exactly are we asking for, is really important. Because if you just ask a state, I need your Mussel data, that email is not going to get answered. Even state to state sharing, right? There's just restrictions on it, state to Fed sharing. So knowing, what do we really need? What are we really talking about? Do we just need to know the distribution of mussels over watersheds grossly at a certain time? Like that, I think that's a pretty important first step to answer, because that's how a lot of the goal implementation teams function. Like the stream health functions in that way. There's a baseline measurement, and it's changed from the baseline. But like expecting species level data at the point scale, one, is unrealistic, and two, I don't know what purpose that provides for measuring like a restoration goal and then distributing it. So I think that's a really important thing to think about, is what's almost the purpose of the goal and the action, and then go from there, because that dictates, what type of data aggregation and sharing are we really talking about.
Yeah, that was mentioned that, and I know in the chat, Brian and some others were chiming on the chat about the data sharing agreements and how restrictive it is. So I don't know if anyone else wants to comment further on that or not.
Yeah, I see Lisa has her hand up.
I know, sorry. But yeah, thank you, Matt, for bringing that up, and Brian and everybody. And we've been going through this with other types of rare species data in the Northeast. And I think I think Matt was kind of alluding to it, but just to make it really explicit, I think having everybody agree to the part, what the data is being used for, and making sure that the folks that have gathered this data are comfortable with the planned interpretation, because data is not flat in terms of the methods that it was used to generate it, unless we're all following the same protocols. But making sure that, we're giving you information to answer a very specific question, and then this has happened to states in the past, which makes them a little sensitive. Somebody else will pick that data up and do something completely unrelated, or not what it was planned for, and make an interpretation back to the states that they don't agree with. That's not what that should be representing, and we don't agree with it. And as regulatory entities, we get a little sensitive about that sort of stuff, because it often gets misinterpreted. So thank you, Matt. And I second that wholeheartedly.
Mary, your hand is up. You can take the mic next.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I had sort of similar thoughts to Matt and Lisa, that probably the best approach would be to figure out, what we want to get out of the data. I think an exercise in making a big database and compiling it just for the sake of that purpose is probably not a good goal. But if we can figure out what products, what question we're trying to answer, and come at it from that way. For instance, a list or a map of streams that are high priority for biodiversity or restoration, and come at it from that angle, and then see the best approach there. Perhaps each state should answer that question on their own, and then we can kind of, as a group, put that all together. Something along those lines.
I'm hearing pretty clearly that aggregating the freshwater mussel data is an important item, but that really the first steps are figuring out how the data will be used, or what questions are being asked of data.
Yeah, what are we trying to measure exactly, or represent? And that's why I think of like other like biological organism goals. They like brook trout has a goal, and that's how the data are shared and displayed. The state of Maryland DNR doesn't give the Bay program point level brook trout abundance. They give them catchment level brook trout presence, most likely, or like area occupied, and that's how that GIT measures change. So knowing what it is we want to measure affects what data would be provided.
Inventory freshwater mussel data and plan to fill gaps where contemporary assessment is lacking. The topic we're just discussing and that one that I just mentioned are probably pretty tightly related. Mussel data and the assessments or inventories of mussels in the various jurisdictions or watersheds is absolutely vital to to advancing conservation and restoration for maintaining mussel biodiversity. I assume that there's value in those information sets.
Red bag.
Water quality best management practices as well. I have under the closed scientific gaps, there's a couple things there, including bold and underline to initiate denitrification studies that feature or involve freshwater mussels in the Bay region as something that has to take place in order to qualify as a best management practice. And I agree with what Joe and Lisa said a few moments ago too, about maybe overly expecting freshwater mussels to become a BMP. Whether or not that ultimately happens, that there is an interest in the evaluation of that process, and that process in the Bay framework is fairly explicit. And there needs to be some studies in the Bay region. So I mean, I guess this may be discussions for past today's meeting. I guess is there anything that you guys see that should be on this slide that's not on this slide? Or is there anything that you see that's on this slide that maybe isn't a priority or isn't a near-term priority and shouldn't be? And I'll take the slide deck back one. You know, the intention is to try to figure out what these items for movement are going to become. So if you're following my logic, what we're thinking is that from a list like this or this list, or maybe something that, you know, we get to the near-term actions that folks in the partnership can put their energies and efforts towards.
This is Jess Jones.
Yeah.
The one thing that I would just add on this, it'd be nice to have, as the effort matures and grows, just a consolidation of the ongoing projects now that meet some of these both conservation and scientific goals. And so there's a number of things that are happening now that could be highlighted, you know, just so people are aware of some of the ongoing work. And I think it would be helpful to people to, you know, just understand, you know, what's being initiated now. And then as things come online, that it can be added to a list. So it might fit under, you know, both of these different categories, but would help promote like the greater awareness about freshwater mussels and some of the ongoing efforts.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Jess. As you were talking, my eyes were seizing on that promote greater awareness item. I think that is absolutely valuable.
Jamie, that was kind of what I was getting at yesterday when we were talking. Is I think everybody recognizes the importance of developing conservation plans to meet these needs, and there's actually a lot of that already going on. And promoting what's already going on, I think would go a long way. Right, the Virginia conservation planning effort, the Pennsylvania planning effort, like it's in fact so much of a priority, like a lot of that was already in the works before these meetings even took place.
So far, you've heard me mention the Bay framework quite a bit, and obviously you guys are well aware that it's not the only framework and certainly not the only apparatus, and by far not the only group of people who are interested in freshwater mussels, and particularly in their biodiversity and conservation status. Again, I've got the hyperlinks in here. So the Freshwater Mollusk Conservation Society, a leading advocate for mussel conservation in North America, and a lot of resources and a lot of work groups and committees. And I would well imagine that many of you are members and probably active participants in what the Mollusk Conservation Society is all about and up to. And then also, Matt, as you were saying, the state wildlife action plans, these are essentially blueprints for conserving fish and wildlife and preventing endangered species. Again, I'm sure it's not news, but the state wildlife action plans are all to be updated by 2025. And at that point, they're intended to cover the subsequent 10-year period. So I think this is great timing and opportunity to within the Bay jurisdiction and the Bay ecosystem to ensure that those state wildlife action plans are addressing freshwater mussels in terms of biodiversity, conservation, and restoration status. Is that, Matt, is that consistent with your ideas?
Yeah, I think kind of getting to a little bit of what we talked about yesterday, and maybe what Jess was talking about. Maybe not so much anybody in this group turning out their own action plan as a result of today's meeting, right? Not necessarily three people from this meeting leave and say, we're going to develop a conservation plan, but highlight how, use this forum to highlight how these conservation plans are already being drafted, and how state wildlife action plans guide agency work and funding.
And I'll just jump in there. One of the things you have, I'm glad to see you have the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agency stuff and the State Wildlife Action Plans things in there. Thank you. And I would just say for the Northeast states from West Virginia to Maine, there's the Northeast Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. So that big group, the national group, has regional subdivisions, and the Northeast Association has a Fish and Wildlife Diversity Technical Committee. And so Brian Watson's on it with me, and we can be a conduit to those states. So notwithstanding what Matt said, if this group developed recommendations related to the Chesapeake or related to mussel restoration at a regional scale, there is an audience in the Northeast for that. And the wildlife action planners who are currently starting to write would be receptive to those recommendations going into their plans. So I think it could be, Matt is right, but it also could be a two-way street, that if this group develops some goals, targets, restoration objectives and things, that we could amplify that in terms of, then it would be in our plans. And when you go to seek funding, you could say, this is in the Northeast states wildlife action plans, or even the Southeast, Virginia straddles the two. So just something to think about is this can be a communication in both directions. And the tech committee, and Matt should have mentioned this explicitly, like we helped get the Brookfloater working group going. We helped get the yellow lamp mussel working group going. So those two working groups are range wide for the species, but obviously they have an impact for the Chesapeake Bay system. So making sure you mention, like, hey, there's already some standardized sampling and science going on around those two specific species, and we should highlight that and add to it as opposed to trying to reinvent it. So I think you're totally on the right track with trying to figure out who's already in the sandbox and organize around who's in the sandbox and just, you know, amplify and cooperate. So thank you. This is great, but whatever we can do, and I'll volunteer Brian too, to get that message back to the wildlife action planners, you know, we will do that.
Okay.
So Lisa, you're right too, because if you remember, the Barry Wicklow green floater assessment kind of originated from a recommendation of the Chesapeake Bay Freshwater Mussel Work Group to
Right.
I guess it was RCN technical committee at the time. So yeah, I still envision that role being very specific, where recommendations are made to maybe larger groups, but not, right? None of us took that work on within the work group, but we realized a need for it, and the need was beyond our capabilities, and it got a whole host of things in action.
Yep. I agree.
That does seem to, again, to my ears, to be a priority item for action, especially with the 2025 deadline for these updates on the wildlife action plans looming. Now would seem to be the very appropriate time to start that two-way communication. And I'll ask the question again: is and this is maybe a hard way to do this, but is there anything glaringly missing from the list? Are there things that really do rise to the near-term priority status for either group? Building capacity for augmentation, is that propagation and stalking?
Yes.
Okay, we'll add that.
If we're going to go down that road, and I don't disagree with that idea, then another thing that I would say is a priority is to develop BMPs in the sense of genetics, disease control, similar to what people do with fish restoration, that moving live animals around from watershed to watershed related to diseases and invasives and all of that is very important. And that kind of has been called for in a number of fora and has not come yet. So I think there's other awareness that would, if we added on, like this is something that is desperately needed. And there's some momentum to hopefully get that started.
Okay.
Just if we're going to go down the propagation road, we should have some agreed upon principles for disease control and genetic guidelines, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Segue into, got just a couple of slides that shows some of the summary information from the survey that SRBC sent around in April. And I will say there has been a fairly consistent theme of creating some sort of a contact list and a directory of names, or at least technical service points of contact. We haven't ignored that comment or that request. As an agency, we have a lot of constraints or conditions around the sharing of personal information, and particularly for information that's not part of our agency. So that's something that I think we will have to explore down the road with the steering committee or the membership overall as to how we can accommodate that interest and that request. And I think that there are ways that we can do that. It just may not be that there will be an actual directory that is just wide open and available. But if people are interested in finding a freshwater mussel expert in a particular state or in the Chesapeake region, I think at least as a concept, the webpage that we'll put out can have, maybe some contact information at the state agencies, or even a email box that if there are questions and particular requests, that they can come into to those of us in this room now, and we can work within the partnership to figure out how to connect someone to the person of interest. Slide has a couple of the questions that we asked, and I put this one up here just to basically show the overall group. Again, we're not giving out a directory right now, Most of you probably know each other as it is, but we wanted to point out that on the chart to the left, the question was to self-identify your area or areas of expertise. We had 42 people respond out of 115 email addresses that we actually connected with on our solicitation to take the survey. So we had a pretty, I think a pretty good rate of response, around 35%. Numerically, we could have more than 42 answers to this question because people could pick more than one area of expertise. Essentially, we're put this up here just to show that we have a spectrum of skills and interests and areas that I think serve the overall partnership really well. The first, going from top to bottom on the left, the first 4 bars, again, probably not surprised to anyone, show the skills, the interest, the affinity for people who are basically working underwater on freshwater issues. So the top bar was that people have a freshwater mussel ecology or biology experience and expertise. A lot of people there. The dark blue bar below that one is experience and expertise in mussel propagation. So that goes to that item we were just discussing on the last slide. The next 2 bars, the orange one and the teal, I guess, if I got my paint chip colors right, speak to more general ecology or fisheries ecology and general aquatic ecology skills and interests. Below that group, we get into some more variety, folks who have identified as being interested or experienced in watershed restoration in orange. The purple bar represents focus on urban landscapes and the built environment. And then we get into outreach and education and policy and regulations. And I did not go through all the comments and have them memorized as to what the other groups and categories are, but we got a good range of skills and experiences that people bring to bear to this partnership. The chart on the right just shows the geographies, and again, people could identify as having experience and work in more than one jurisdiction, and so you can see that by percentage we exceed 100% in the responses. But again, we've got the full Chesapeake Bay ecosystem represented, with the exception of the District of Columbia. And you can also see that there's certainly concentration in some of the larger states or some of the Bay focused states like Maryland, Pennsylvania. Then the other slide that I wanted to bring up related to our survey was just going back to these questions that we asked about participation in the partnership specific to each of these 2 core groups. So question 3 was, you answer questions related to your interest or affinity for mussels as natural filters or as a water quality enhancement mechanism. And the chart on the right is same thing, except for mussels as a biodiversity conservation and restoration core interests. So the green bar was answering, whether you're interested in being part of the steering committee. Now that you've seen how we've defined and maybe offered suggestions for the partnership, you may or may not want to, retain that interest in being part of the steering committee. The dark blue bar really, that gets to your interest in being in a work group lead or participating in the near-term action items. And again, some of those action items are going to transcend and work well for both groups. Others are going to be more lined up with one versus the other. Yellow or orange was, essentially, I'm really interested in the information and the networking, and I want to take part in an annual symposium. But, I'm either not interested or I just don't have the time or the capacity to be part of the more inner workings. And that, that's very understandable and justified. The last bars, you'll see it kind of got cut off. It's not that I'm not interested in freshwater mussels. It is more specifically, I'm not interested in participating in either the natural filters work group or the biodiversity conservation group. And again, I can say that, having gone through the survey responses, there is a lot of mutual interest in freshwater mussels overall. There wasn't so much that I'm only interested in one, not the other. And we didn't really have anything else that we were going to speak to about the survey response. We appreciate you guys taking part in it, and also am grateful for you guys have probably seen a lot of emails from SRBC between the survey and this meeting. We're trying not to bombard your inboxes, but we are trying to reach and capture and give people opportunities to participate. Your opinions for sure count, and we welcome your participation. And just offer opportunity for news and announcements. Okay, well, if something does occur to you, feel free to drop it in the chat. We're just about to the end. Next steps. So some next steps are pretty obvious to us, and some are going to probably require some more interaction. But coming soon, we will have a web page devoted to the Regional Freshwater Mussel Partnership. Essentially, exactly what we have in mind for the Freshwater Mussel Regional Partnership, but it's a model that works well for us. We don't have it for the Source Water Protection Partnership, but we can include a calendar of upcoming meetings and events. As far as next steps, I think we will have to figure out who will take part in the steering committee and who will take part in some of these work group leaderships. And so we may be reaching out to some of you, or if you have a strong interest in joining, please reach out to us. I have heard from Matt and Joe and several others who spend a lot of time underwater with mussels or other parts of the aquatic ecosystem that you're probably already busy and will be for the coming summer months. So the biodiversity conservation and restoration focus may have a necessary hiatus through the summer. I won't pretend to think that the rest of the group is also unavailable over the summer, but there may be more availability around the water quality enhancement goals to have a summer meeting. I think it's probably advisable that we have some sort of steering committee meeting through the summer season. But probably the overall partnership would really be looking to meet again sometime in the fall, either as a whole group or perhaps as individual work groups. We also, I think, are looking towards next spring or late winter, calendar year 2024, for an annual symposium type event where we bring everybody together and we can, just talk about freshwater mussels overall, as well as some of the progress or next steps for the group. Another next step from our end will be when our webpage is up and running, we will blast out an announcement to everybody that's in our contact list. And when that website goes up, if not before, we'll have this slide deck available. We'll have some sort of a synthesis of today's meeting, provide a link to the recording. Well, we're really grateful for the opportunity to join the group. We really appreciate your time, not just today, but all along. We're also grateful for your participation and willingness to volunteer. Here's the contact information for the three of us in the room, and as well as Hillary, who I mentioned, and you probably received a number of emails from Hillary already. She will be supporting our group as well. If you've got thoughts, questions, advice, feel free to reach out to any or all of us. Thanks again for your participation. We really appreciate it.